In this painting, you will utilize the single and double controlled wet edge in a simple still life. You will choose two colors to use and will layer them. Choose three simple white objects. But you can also roll up pieces of paper to create different cylindrical shapes. Of the three objects in your still life, two of them should be rounded or curved. Set your still life up with a directional light on one side. This could be daylight or a spotlight. As when photographing your work, putting up a white board on one end helps reflect the light to the shadow side of the objects. You can see the difference that makes in these two photographs. It's very helpful to make a small study so that you can understand the value relationships before you start painting. In the last video, I showed how the single and double controlled wet edge can be used to create volume. Here you can see what the single and double controlled wet edge looks like when they're layered together. If you look at them side by side, you can see how they were layered. When layering two colors, it doesn't matter which color is layered first. It's good to try to get a good balance of both. Here are some examples of colors used in past student work. This is cerulean blue and purple, alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. The same two colors are used in this piece, but it looks quite different. It's based on how the colors are balanced together. This painting uses cerulean blue and yellow ochre. Notice how even the background shifts between the ochre and the blue. This is another fine example of the same combination of colors. In this beautiful painting using cerulean blue and yellow ochre, one more layer of cerulean blue in the background would have helped balance the colors a little better. This is a very interesting combination of burnt sienna and green. The green is so beautiful, it would have been nice to have seen a bit more of it, perhaps in the shadow of the box. I will demonstrate the process of how to make a painting using two colors that are layered. Lighten up any dark pencil lines with the kneaded eraser. This is the only kind of eraser that won't damage your paper. You can also press the eraser on the paper to help lift off dark lines. I'm putting the blue background tone in using the large shapes of color technique. I pre-mixed the blue. I'm using my medium and large flat brushes to work quickly to create an even tone. You have to be very careful to not cover up any areas of the painting that will remain white, because that is always the white of the paper showing. If you have a careful drawing down, it should be easy to follow and move around the shapes to create the background. While some artists prefer to put the background in last, I like to put at least one layer in first, so I can understand the value relationship of the background to the edges of the other objects. Here, for the larger, more open areas, I'm very quickly shifting to my 1-inch brush. If you want to create an even background tone, you need to work quickly so the paint doesn't start to dry while you're painting. It's safest to do this with lighter layers, because if the background tone is uneven, you can always correct it with subsequent layers. Now I'll let that dry for a bit, because you can't paint anything next to a part of the painting that's still wet. Now I'll put the two-sided controlled wet edge in the cone and in the tube. I put clear water down first on the side that's on the shadow side of the cone, because that side doesn't need to be as precise as the side where the direct light is coming from. The paint will now just float into the area on the left, and I can focus my attention to the right side. Then I can drag my damp brush against that paint to hold it in place. I'll do the same with the tube that I made from rolled up paper on the bottom. The tube is much narrower, so I have to be very careful to watch to keep that edge in place. Next, I'll put the first layer of color into the shadows. If your shadows aren't too long or difficult, you might try the controlled wet edge on the shadows also. It will make them look a bit more natural. After the two-sided controlled wet edge and some shadows have been put in, Now I'll put in the single-sided controlled wet edge to make the objects have a total sense of volume. I'm putting a light layer of blue paint all the way down the left side of the cone. I've used paint directly from my palette, but I could have also used the premixed paint I used for the background. I'm bringing this all the way up to the edge where the green soft edge is. Just as in your rainbow roll for the single-sided controlled wet edge, you'll take your brush down the edge and keep watching it to make sure it doesn't stray away from where you want it to be. I'll do this also on the tube, and you should do it with any curved or rounded objects that you have in your still life. You can start to see now the effect of using two colors layered over each other. There will be some places in which they're layered together, and some places where each color can be seen on its own. This is quite deliberately a different effect than it would be to mix the colors together. I'm now adding another layer to the shadow side of the box. Once the shadow side of the box is dry, I'll add another layer to the shadow of the box and also again use the controlled wet edge to keep that shadow a bit soft looking. And I'll add a bit of shift of light on the side of the cube, again with a soft edge. After all that is dried, I'm going to make the shadows a little bit darker as they're closer to the objects, but I won't bring that shadow all the way out. I'll let it fade out. I'll put water on the edge of it to let the color float out a bit. After following these basic steps to give my painting a sense of volume and light, I'll look for more subtle details and finishing touches. This included filling the inside of the tube, darkening the shadow side of the box, and adding a little bit more blue to the left lower side of the cone. As long as you work in light layers and feel more comfortable with the controlled wet edge technique, there's no end to the amount of detail and subtle effects you can create. I've decided to add a bit more darkness to the left side of the background because it's a bit too close to the value of the edge of the cone. I will demonstrate how to make a background tone that shifts in color. I first put an ample amount of clear water where I want the tone to end, and it will float into that water. Then with my large flat brush, I put the paint in, carving around the objects to make sure I don't get any of that tone into the white areas of the painting. The big flat brushes are really great for doing things like this. Then I let it just end and float into that clear water. I think the shift of color has worked very nicely. It helps bring out the left blue edge of the cone. There is a very visible soft line where the green blue ends and moves into the pure blue. If this was something I didn't care for, I could have put another light layer of green in the entire background and it would have evened everything out. But I like the way it looks like this, so I'll leave it alone. I also don't want the background to become too dark. I made another similar painting using blue and purple. Now that I've demonstrated how to make the painting, here I'll lay out the steps for you to refer back to. I first put in the background using the large shapes of color technique. I then put in the shadow side of the box and used the controlled double-sided wet edge on the tube and on the cone. I put another layer of shadow on the cone and on the tube using the single wet edge technique. I painted the lighter side of the box and put a second layer on the shadow side of the same box. I also used the controlled soft edge on the shadows. After that was completely dry, I went back in with the purple to put another layer on the shadows. I wanted to create a balance between the two colors in the painting. With all those basic forms and shadows laid out, now it's time for some finishing touches. First, I added a little bit more blue to the bottom left edge of the cone. You can see now that there's a subtle shift from blue to purple. I added another soft layer of blue to the shadows. I didn't bring this layer all the way out to the edge of the other layer, so you can see now there's a nice shift from purple to blue. I did the same thing with the shadow of the tube. I also darkened the inside of the tube to give it a sense of shadow and volume. The top of the tube was very close in value to the background, so I put a soft edge on the tube to make it stand out. And finally, I put one more light layer of blue on the background to shift the color a little bit more to a mixture of blue and purple. There may be additional layers and more subtle details that you can add to your own painting, but remember to keep the layers light because you can always add more. This concludes the basic steps and skills to create a two-color painting using layers of paint.